Hey guys, what is up? SuperKmanrocks here, and we are here for my LCK Week 1 overview, analysis, and of course, at the end, my updated power rankings. We are done with Week 1 in the LCK. We're really starting to get back into the swing of League of Legends here in 2023, and I, for one, could not be more excited. There is a lot to cover, a lot to go over here in Week 1, a lot of really good games, and definitely a good idea of which teams are going to be overperforming and which teams might be underperforming to start the split. So, if you guys are excited for this video, if you enjoyed LCK Week 1 action, let me know down in the comments section below. Of course, I'm going to always ask my question here at the beginning of these videos. What team impressed you the most this week? What team disappointed you the most this week? Who was your player of the week and who was your dud of the week? Let me know all of that, of course, down in the comments section below, but I don't want to waste too much time. Some of these weekly recap videos, and just my videos in general, have been going very long recently, and now we're really starting to get back into the swing of reviewing every single series that happens in League of Legends across the major regions, and so I'm going to try to speed this one up a tad bit. I don't want this one going 2 hours long, and so, you know, hold me to that in the comments section. Of course, if I'm going too long, let me know, but let's go ahead and jump right into it. We kicked off Week 1, and we kicked off the LCK in 2023 with a matchup between Dam1, or Dplus KIA, I should say, the renamed Dplus KIA, and DRX, the reigning world champions. It's a really, really fun matchup that I think has a lot of potential for interesting storylines. Obviously, these teams swapping bot laners, DRX basically getting an entirely new roster outside of Beryl, DK bringing in Kana in the top lane. Really, there's a lot to like about this matchup in terms of a narrative perspective, and unfortunately, the narratives were really all we had in terms of the series being interesting because it was a complete and utter stomp on the side of Dplus KIA. They were phenomenal in this series. They took an easy 2-0 series lead. They dominate Game 1. They dominate Game 2. It really was not close at any point in the series. Looking at DK's side, what exactly went right? Well, a lot went right. In Game number 1, I think they gave player of the game to Canyon on the Elise, and while I do understand that, and especially when you look at what Dam1 has been doing, and sorry if I call them Dam1 instead of D+, I'm super used to it. It's going to take some time to break me of that habit. When you look at what D+ has been doing, not only here in the LCK, obviously in this series, but if you've been watching Challengers Korea, their team has actually been playing a very similar comp to what they played here in Game 1. A lot of Elise Gnar on the top side and then a winning bot lane, something that can push forward early. They really want to try to get this game snowballed out of control and then move forward. That's clearly what they've been practicing in a lot of scrims, in-house scrims at the very least, and I think Canyon plays the Elise very well. We've been seeing the Elise be very hit or miss across competitive over the course of the year so far. I would say if you're the better jungler and you have the better team around you, like DK did in this series, oftentimes you're going to make it look like you're going to make it look like it's OP. And that's what happened in this game. Canyon was awesome, but to me, player of the game in Game number 1, kind of back and forth, but I thought Showmaker was phenomenal on this Ryze. You continue to give him his best pick. Ryze is really good in the meta right now. Not surprised at all to see him completely outplay Fate on that Taliyah. We'll get to that in a bit. And then I actually thought Kana was really, really good on the Gnar. Obviously, a lot of pressure on the top side from Canyon. Kana was kind of the recipient of that, but I thought Kana had a really good bounce-back game here. Obviously, didn't have the best of 2022s on that Nongshim team. You're just kind of hoping he can turn that around. And then game number 2, again, a really good performance from pretty much everybody. I really liked Showmaker on the Syndra, but game number 2 was pretty much all about the Sivir. It was all about Deft on this Sivir being able to take over the game towards the back half, really just snowball it out of control, and Deft is going to get my player of the series. Deft facing his former team last year, the team that he won the World Championships on. To see him really perform and honestly, in my opinion, outperform a lot of what he was able to do last year, that's really, really impressive, and that's a great sign. I was kind of interested to see what was going to happen with Deft, if he was going to come in and be more of a weak side bot laner, kind of similar to what he was last year. Not a weak side, but more of a low resource bot laner like he was on DRX for most of the year. If they wanted to invest a lot into Kana on the top side, who has always kind of been a higher resource top laner, at least in comparison to some of the other top laners in the region, but Deft got a lot of the resources here in game number 2, and it looked really good. Him and Kellen together as a duo is something that I was really excited about in my preview, in my preseason power rankings video, and that really showed up in this one. Obviously, Sivir Yumi's not exactly the most difficult bot lane to play in the entire world, but even on the Lucian Nami, they looked fantastic. Kellen on that Nami in game number 1 was stellar. He was really, really great, and honestly, I think if these two can continue to grow together, Kellen's one of those players that I've always said is one of the most underrated in the entire world. You could make an argument he's like a top 20 player in the world. He just doesn't kind of get that recognition. You give him a player like Deft who's hyper consistent and they can kind of push forward in the lane with or without resources. That's always going to be positive. The solo laners played great, even though Kana was a little bit up and down, I would say, over the course of the second game. I thought Showmaker was really good in this series. Canyon controlled the pacing of it, especially on that Lee Sin Yuumi combo can be really, really dangerous to have to deal with. Even if you're like a Jax or something that can typically deal with it relatively okay, it's just really hard because he's going to be super tanky towards the back half of that game, and Yuumi just makes every fight more difficult. And so for Damwon, or for Dplus, I should say, really, really did like how they performed in their first series of the year here in 2023. As for DRX, not as stoked. There are some positives, most notably Rascal. I thought Rascal played really well in this series, and it definitely feels like he was the only one trying to step up for DRX. We talked about that a lot on KT last year, especially in the spring, where it really felt like there was nobody on that team that was trying to win except for Rascal. Obviously, Summer was a different story. Aiming was fantastic in Summer, but there were definitely moments last year where it felt like Rascal was like the guy trying to win games. Hopefully it's not the same thing here on DRX. You're hoping that you can get more out of some of these quote-unquote role players, but Rascal looked good in this series on the Jax, 2 games of it. Really the frustrating part is everything else. Everything else just kind of got run over. You had Krako playing 2 games of Maokai, which, if you're playing Maokai, you just simply have to win. The pick is so ridiculously broken in the meta right now. You have to be relevant, and Krako did not play it well. I was very disappointed. Krako was somebody who I was actually very high on going into the year. I feel like he has been underrated by a majority of the analysts for how he has played over the past few years. He was a big part of why that Liiv SANDBOX team was so effective last year, but this was not a good start to the year. Yes, it's against Canyon, and it's against Dplus, which is, it's a hard matchup to go into, but still, you got to see more out of Krako, especially if he's going to get some of the more OP picks in the meta right now, like the Maokai. Fate was garbage in the mid lane. There's really no other way to say it. I think there's a real case to be made. He is the dud of the series here. Not going to give it to him, but there's a real case to be made. He was definitely the worst player in game number 1 here on the Taliyah. It is such an ego pick to pick Taliyah into Ryze, especially when Fate's Taliyah isn't really all that good, and so he gets completely run over, not only in terms of lane pressure, but in terms of macro pressure. The Ryze constantly has the split push. Taliyah is basically never able to keep up. You get a more standard mid lane matchup, Burst Mage versus Control Mage, in game number 2, but even then, Fate's just not on the same level as a player like Showmaker, and that is very, very, very clear. Fate was one of the worst players in this series, but my pick for dud of the series on DRX is going to go to Dektum at the AD carry position. Deft and Kellen just completely ran over Dektum and Beryl. To me, it is very clear that Deft got an upgrade in the support position, and Dektum kind of got a downgrade here. I'm not going to say that was entirely it, but Dektum looked completely outclassed. He was getting pressured a lot in game number 2 on that Zeri, and he just was not able to keep up. 2 very, very, very poor games. He was outputting basically negative damage, even with a lot of the resources being invested into him. You look at the rest of these comps, you've got him, especially in game 1, you've got a Maokai, you've got a Taliyah, you've got a Yuumi. That Zeri really needs to be able to perform. Just wasn't able to do that. Game number 2, obviously, you have a few more options with the Victor in the mid lane, but for the most part, you still need Dektum to step up and not just run it down in lane in the 2v2, and that's kind of what happened. So Dektum, gonna get my dud of the series. Beryl wasn't all that good either, although I guess he didn't make any major mistakes. He just wasn't all that positive, which for the most part is kind of a good game for Beryl compared to what he had a lot of summer last year, but I'm really concerned about this DRX team. This bot lane looked awful, and if that continues, this team is going to be bad. There's really no other way to put it. I'm not sure they're going to play like this all year long. Again, it's only the first series of the year. I don't want to overreact, but this team did not look good. The mid-jungle duo looked very bad, which is very concerning to me because Krako really needs to step up if you want this team to be like top 6, a playoff team. If he's not there, especially on a pick like Maokai, that's concerning. Fate was bad. He was really bad last year too, and if that carries over, that's not good. Really, the only shining light for DRX this series was Rascal on the Jax. He still made some mistakes, don't get me wrong, but he at least was making plays. He at least was trying to win the game. I think that was really all you could say. For Dplus, they looked great. I mean, everything was kind of clicking here. Clearly, they have a play style of wanting to snowball the game early. You pick the Elise, you pick the Lee Sin. A lot of these skirmish-oriented junglers that want to try to make plays in the early 5 to 8 minute mark. Canyon did a really good job of being able to push that tempo, being able to push that pace, and pretty much everybody followed up well. Kana and Showmaker were really good in the solo lanes. Deft and Callan were absolutely dominant in game number 2. If Dplus can play like this the entire year, they are going to live up to that number 2 ranking that I gave them in my power rankings, but really, really good start to the year for them, not so much for DRX. Moving on to series number 2 of our kickoff day here in the LCK, and it's a fun one. It's a rematch of the 2022 Summer Finals and Spring Finals, I guess you could say, in the LCK. The top 2 teams going to Worlds last year from Korea. We had T1 versus Gen.G. Always great to get these two fantastic organizations kicking off the season against each other. One of them, no changes at all. The other one, kind of a new look team. Obviously, top side's the same, but bot lane, definitely some question marks, and those question marks definitely arose in this series as T1 is able to take a pretty dominant 2-0 series win here over Gen.G. This isn't too much of a surprise. I had T1 as the #1 team going into the season here in my spring power rankings video. Gen.G came in at number 3. I still think they're going to be solid, but T1's just kind of on a different level right now with how they played at Worlds and the fact that they're going to have such a heads-up start on everybody else with, all 5 of their members returning. It felt pretty inevitable that they were going to kick off the season in a really strong fashion, and you know what? That's exactly what they did. Game number 1 was a lot of fun. Really just kind of waiting out a lot of the pressure that Gen.G wanted to go for early. We talked about Dplus in the last series really favoring this early aggression jungler and transitioning that lead into something that they can, be proactive with in the mid game, kind of try and get your laners ahead so they can carry your jungler in the later half. That's what Gen.G went for. They went for the Elise K'Sante duo, and I'm going to be honest, I love this. I think Elise K'Sante is going to be incredibly scary to play against. A lot of the year, once teams really start to get, it down a bit more, I think it's still a little bit up in the air with how to play it early, but if you can get K'Sante rolling, he's definitely going to be able to carry Elise into basically whatever win you want. Pair that up with something like the Zeri. It's an interesting draft. One of the concerns that I want to talk about in game number 1, which we'll get to, is you have your best player on by far the most passive pick on the team here. You've got Chovy on the Taliyah. Definitely something I'm a little concerned about, but T1 does a really good job of waiting that out in the early game. Owner does a great job of making sure Peanut's never really in a place where he can just take advantage of Elise's early game strength, and by the time you hit that mid game, T1 is outscaled basically so hard. Lucian Nami's at 2 items. That's going to absolutely destroy you. You have Faker on the Azir playing really well. Zeus on the Gnar with the initiations. Basically, everybody in game 1 has outscaled at that point, and T1's just able to pick up the victory. And then in game number 2, it's just a lot of back and forth. It's a lot of nothing for the first part of the game. I think it was like 0-0 at 18 minutes, but you end the game at 24-6. I mean, it is a ridiculous outpour in the mid to late game of fight after fight after fight after fight, and a lot of that is fantastic initiations by my player of the series here, Faker. Faker was fantastic to start the year. You gotta love that. He gets one of his classic picks here in Lissandra in game number 2. I know a lot of people don't really associate Lissandra with him, but I think a lot of these metas that Lissandra maybe hasn't been the most pickable. Faker has still been willing to pull out the champion because the initiation and the onus of going in and creating for your team is on Lissandra. You can absolutely do that as that champion. There aren't a lot of mid lane champions that can do that basically on their own. Lissandra is absolutely one of them. Faker, quite frankly, just outplayed everybody on the opposing team, whether that was Chovy in lane on the Ahri, where he was just dodging every single charm, whether that was Peanut on the Vi, where Vi would insta-ult the Lissandra, and so what would he do? He would just EW in and just get all his shit off before getting Vi ulted, right? And then just try to ult himself. Faker really just had a great idea for how he wanted to play out this mid to late game, and man, did it work out, because he was fantastic, creating so much space for the rest of his team to work. Most notably, obviously, Gumayusi on this Lucian, who did play really well. His positioning continues to look really solid. This felt much more like Worlds Gumayusi than it did Summer Split Gumayusi, who I still thought was pretty okay. I had no worries that Guma was going to bounce back in 2023. A lot of people were asking if it was going to be more of a down split again, because he wasn't perfect over the course of the back half of 2022. It felt like he really got his confidence back, though, at the World Championships, and I expected that to continue. It looked great here, and I gotta talk about him. KIA was phenomenal. You want to give KIA player of the series? He absolutely deserves it. The 2 games of Nami, it's just a complete difference what a fantastic Nami and an average Nami looks like. Yes, Lucian Nami is ridiculously overpowered in the meta right now. I'm really not going to try and dispute that, but there is a difference between some of the best players in the world playing that champion and just like an average player. KIA is one of the best players in the world, and he continues to show it. I've been very high on KIA, at points calling him the best support in the world, like I am right now. I do think he is the best support in the world, and I think this series is a great example of why I think that. He's just able to take over the game in ways other supports aren't able to. Owner and Zeus were also good, just not necessarily the focal points of this series. For Gen.G, not what you wanted to see to kick off the season. Like I said, really did not like the thought process behind the Game 1 draft. I do think that this draft on paper is actually solid. K'Sante, Elise, Talia, Zeri, Lulu. You have a lot of options in the early game to try and get your K'Sante rolling out of control, and then if that doesn't work, you've got Zeri to kind of pick up the slack in the back half of the game to be able to win those team fights. The problem is you're putting a ton, and I mean a ton of pressure on your rookie bot laner, Pez, who's coming in and playing his first series in the LCK with a support that really hasn't played super well at this level before, and so you're really relying a lot on these players that have proven almost nothing to step up and taking the onus off of your world-class, your world-caliber players. Players like Chovy, who's on the Talia, who really just kind of has to sit and hope his team can win him the game in this one. Obviously, he can help, but he can't win the game for his team, and that ends up being what happens, right? As he just gets outscaled, there's really not much he can do, and the rest of the team kind of falls apart. In game number 2, it's a pretty similar story. Chovy plays really bad in lane. There's really no other way to say that. Missing charms, not really being able to outplay Faker. Credit to Faker, he played phenomenal on that Lissandra, but Chovy had no impact on that game. Peanut had negative impact on that game, and, you know, I'll just say it now, Peanut is my dud of the series here. I'm still pretty high on Peanut, but he did get outplayed in the series. It does feel like Worlds had a little bit of an impact on his mental. This was not a very traditionally good series from Peanut. Obviously, he has some of these every once in a while. He's not the most consistent jungler in the entire world. I'm not going to overreact to him not playing perfect in his first series of the year, but it'll be interesting to see what happens maybe when he plays teams that aren't T1. He just didn't have a good one. The Elise was shut down in the early game. He was not able to get anyone snowballed. And if that's the case when you're on Elise, the game is doomed. And then the Vi in game number 2, those ultimates are just not working. Vi is one of those picks. I'll talk about this in pretty much every weekly review I do right now. Vi feels a little bit like bait to me right now. The pick is okay, and it does the one thing it does kind of okay, but players know how to play around it now. Look at what happened when Faker got ulted. He just went in and did all his shit, and then just died for it, but he still got all his shit off. I mean, you look at Vi as a counter, quote-unquote, to Zeri. Well, players know how to space that now because they've been playing against it for a year. Zeri's been meta for a very long time. And so Vi just feels like one of those picks where if you're not actively better, like if you're not winning, Vi feels kind of useless, and that's what it felt like here in game number 2. So Peanut's going to get my dud of the series. I think you could give it to Chovy. He really did nothing in the series, but game 1 was hardly his fault in my opinion. And then, honestly, this bot lane also played bad. You gotta take a lot away from this bot lane, especially in game number 2, where they got completely rolled. I mean, Faker was on this Zeri all game long, and there was absolutely nothing Pez could do. A lot of that was missed positions, a lot of that was over-aggression, but again, a lot of it was Faker playing really well. So I don't want to punish him too much by giving him dud of the series, especially because in game number 1, he was kind of the one keeping them afloat, even if he was just picking up a lot of the revenge kills, quote-unquote. It was still okay, but game number 2 was just a disaster. Delight looks like he's going to be a problem for this team. Obviously, again, you're playing against the best support in the world. I don't want to criticize him too hard, but I'm really worried about how this bot lane is going to keep up, because in series number 1, it just did not look like they were going to. And so for Gen.G, you gotta hope they're able to turn things around. This was about as disastrous of a start to the year as you could get. Obviously, there are some direct areas that you can clean up. I think getting Chovy on something more aggressive, perhaps making sure Peanut can get an early lead and kind of transition that, and then maybe take some of the onus off of the bot lane, maybe transition a lot of that up to the top side. I talked about how Doran should be getting more responsibility this year. I would like to see that. He didn't really get it in this series, but some obvious areas to fix for Gen.G, but they certainly do have to fix them. And then for T1, it's business as usual. Faker looks great, Guma looks great, Keria looks great, topside looked good. There's really not a lot that I could say that you need to fix. They played their style and they played it well. That's exactly what I thought was going to happen going into 2023, and as it turns out, keeping 5 of your 5 members from last year as a World Finals team is a pretty good recipe for success early on in the season. Jumping into day 2 now. Kicking off day 2 was certainly an interesting series. 2 teams that I think underperformed last year, but certainly underwent pretty major roster changes in opposite directions. We had a matchup between the Kwangdong Freecs and Hanwha Liiv Esports that HLE was able to pick up a win in. Now, this was expected. The 2-0 happened. However, certainly wasn't as clean as I think a lot of people wanted it to be, most specifically that game number 1. So let's talk about it. Game number 1 was a miraculous win for Hanwha Liiv. I mean, this was Zeka versus the world. It continues to be a little bit of a scary issue to see Zeka on a team where he just doesn't have a lot of the team around him for him to win games consistently. I mean, you bring Kingen over, sometimes a good sign, sometimes not. Oh boy, this jungle position looks scary. Maybe it's Zeka. I don't know. I don't want to say this, but God, it just seems to follow him everywhere. It was like this on BLG. It was like this on DRX. This jungle position, it continues to be a problem, even on Maokai, which we will get to, but man, Zeka looks good. Not only is he able to win a lot of fights here as the Silas, he's able to do a lot of damage, keep his team in the game. Even this bot lane really wasn't performing. But he ends up winning the game for them. I mean, the backdoor is absolutely huge. They lose that game if he doesn't make that play. And so, absolutely massive from him. He basically steals a win from KDF. And then he wins it again in game number 2 here on the Akali. A fantastic performance from him. Obviously, a very good bounce back in game number 2 here from Viper, who I was really excited about on this team. Obviously, I saw him as a top 280 carry in the entire world. Him and Zeka together as a carry duo, if they can get on the same page, are going to be fantastic. But it's such a no-brainer as to who this player of the series is. I mean, there really is no second thought. It's Zeka, and it's not even close. He was absolutely carrying this team. This was honestly kind of reminiscent of the Chovy Life Esports teams from 2020, where it just felt like it was Chovy versus the world, and nobody else was going to win that game. It was just going to be mid lane. This series felt like that. It very much felt like Zeka is either going to win Hanwha Life the series, or they are going to lose because they are not playing particularly well. Now, there is a lot of talent on this team. I don't think it's just Zeka, but man, series number 1 was not particularly good from a expectation standpoint for Hanwha Life. Viper Life, like I said, played a lot better once they got that Lucian Nami in game number 2, but we continue to see that Jhin support come out, this time for Life, as a counter to the Heimerdinger. I understand that it's a good counter, and it does a lot, but it's just not working at a pro level right now. It's working in solo queue. It's not working at a pro level. I thought it looked really bad in game number 1, even though they won the game. Taiyun and June actually looked pretty good in that Ashe Heimerdinger lane, which, by the way, is ridiculously oppressive to play into. Very, very difficult to have to deal with. I thought Viper and Life didn't actually play all that well in game number 1, but like I said, the Lucian Nami was a lot better in game number 2. It was a lot more cohesive, a lot better in general, but I mean, look at the draft in game number 2 for Hanwha Life. KDF lost this game in draft. I mean, they gave over Maokai and Lucian Nami. How are you allowed to do that? What are you trading for this? I just don't understand. Very, very odd. It felt like they really wanted to lose this series, not only because they throw away game number 1 with a poorly timed objective call that loses them the game on a backdoor, but also in game number 2, they just give over literally every single power pick in the meta. Not only are you giving over Maokai, not only are you giving over Lucian Nami, but you're giving Zeka his best champion in Akali. Like, I don't understand the thought process for KDF. It didn't really click for me. I thought most of the players on the team played okay, most specifically Youngjae and Bulldog. I thought it had really good chemistry. Dudu was fantastic in game number 1 on this Aatrox. He was really keeping the game alive in game number 1, where he was dominating a lot of those team fights. He was probably the biggest reason KDF was pushing forward, but in game number 2, it was a little bit less interactive with him on the Fiora going into that Gnar, really not as much he could do. Youngjae and Bulldog, I thought, played really well in game number 1 on the Sedge into Leah. Not a lot of damage coming out from that side. That really was just going to be the Aatrox, but a lot of setup being done. Youngjae just out-jungled Clid. There's really no other way to put it. And I was really impressed with that. And then Bulldog, I thought, looked fine. I got a lot of comments about how Bulldog was going to be a lot better than I gave him credit for. I thought he was fine in this series. Really wasn't, like, sensational. Wasn't changing my entire opinion on him. But was okay. Was going into one of the better mids in the entire world. And so give him credit for being able to hold his own. And then Taiyun and June, like I said, won game 1, as far as I'm concerned, on this Ashe Heimerdinger. They had way more pressure. Game number 2 was obviously a different story. But for KDF, it was okay. I think the one player that I really want to talk about in this series is Clid. Whew, I mean, I don't often give dud of the series to a player on the winning team, especially in a 2-0. It feels really weird to give dud of the series to a player who just won 2-0. But God, I mean, there was just no other option. There was no other choice in this series other than Clid for dud of the series. He gets the most broken jungler in the game 2 games in a row, and he completely runs it. I mean, game number 1 is probably the worst jungle performance I've seen in a very, very long time. I mean, that is like an elo merchant right there. The fact that he won that game is absolutely ludicrous. It's disgusting. It's one of the worst performances I've seen in a long time. He was better in game number 2, but not by a lot. He still wasn't all that good. Still was outplayed by Youngjae. If Clid plays like this the entire year, Hanwha's just simply not a team that can compete for a world championship. It doesn't matter how good Zeka is. It doesn't matter if Viper and Life can turn it around. If Clid plays like this in the jungle, I mean, it's a disaster for Hanwha Life. He is an easy choice for dead of the series. I really don't have a lot to say. He was awful, awful, awful. Hanwha really needs him to turn that around. Obviously, he wasn't perfect last year on FPX. I was a little bit more forgiving, I would say, of his performances last year on that team because it really felt like they needed a catalyst. They needed somebody to go out there and try to win games, and Clid was at least trying to do that. But he doesn't need to do that on this team. You've got Zeka, you've got Viper, you've got players who can win the game for you. He just needs to make sure he doesn't lose the game. That's really all that he needs to do. And he tried his absolute best in this series. KDF clearly paid him off. If he does not turn this around, it is going to be a disaster of a year for Hanwha Life with a roster that really, by all accounts, should be pushing for a world championship. As for KDF, Decent start to the year. Really not going to try to over or underreact to this. They're a young team. They're probably going to need some time to develop. They really haven't played together all that much, any of these players really, and so I'm not going to overreact to them losing a game to projected one of the better teams in the entire world. Zeka played out of his mind. There's really not a lot you can do. Topside played really well, and I think bot lane played well in game number 1. I just want to see more consistency out of these young players. I do think that they are interesting and perhaps better than the number 10 spot, but for now it's just really, really hard to tell, and Hanwha's going to feel very, very lucky to be able to walk out of this with a 2-0 series win. Moving on to our second series here of day number 2. We had another fun one, this time between two teams that don't really have the same kind of expectations that a lot of the teams above them have, but two teams that certainly have interesting compositions either way. We are looking at a matchup between Nongshim RedForce and BRION. Really was interested to see how these two teams would fare playing off against each other. Of course, it is worth noting that a lot of the players in this series, especially BRION, are suffering from COVID at the moment. The coach for BRION suffering from COVID, Effort in his own room suffering from COVID, Raptor, their proposed starting jungler, or maybe their backup jungler, especially now after how the series went. He's not going to be in here. Umti's playing instead because he got COVID. So a lot of different pieces here, kind of not working all the way for BRION, but it didn't matter because guess who's walking out of this series with a 2-0 win? It is BRION. Now, this is pretty standard for this team. You have to remember this organization has always been a spring organization. Remember last year, they made playoffs in spring. This has always been an org and a team that overperforms expectations early on in the year. Now, obviously, I'm not saying that they're for sure going to be a playoff team just because they beat Nongshim, a team full of players who were playing in the LCK Challengers League last year. But it's a good win for them, and honestly, the way that they did it does inspire at least a little bit of confidence in me. Now, game number 1 wasn't exactly the most clean. We gotta start with that. It was very similar to the series we actually just talked about with Hanwha Life, where they really only win because of an Elder flip. And shout out Elder, it's so compelling that teams will trade their Nexus for it, and sometimes that's good, sometimes that's bad, but shout out Lord Morgan, being able to capitalize, teleporting in on the Fiora, being able to end the game there and pick up the win for Bro. That's really solid, because honestly, in these team fights, they weren't really doing all that hot. Din on the Renekton was doing a really good job, and honestly, I was really impressed with Fiesta on this Akali. He was playing super well in game number 1, in my opinion. He was probably the best player in game number 1. Fiesta was always someone who I liked quite a bit, but unfortunately, his contributions to the game here were not enough to bring Nongshim a win. And then game number 2 was a little bit more front to back, a little bit more standard. I would say the comps were a little bit more up and down, but you gotta talk about Morgan again, because even though this guy is down like a ridiculous amount in lane, we gotta talk about this. He picks the Renekton, and he loses lane against a Gragas. This is not what you want to see. It's really not a great performance. He dominates these late game team fights. There was really no other way to put it. You look at a 4-6-6 scoreline across 2 games, and you're like, he was okay. But honestly, he was the reason Fredit BRION, sorry, not Fredit, they're not that team anymore. He was the reason BRION won this series 2-0. He won game number 1 with the backdoor. He won game number 2 with the team fights. He's going to be my player of the series, and I know that's pretty crazy to say, but he honestly was really good here. This is kind of the Morgan special. His mechanics really aren't up to snuff with a lot of the other players in the league. Even a player like Din, who I actually think is pretty solid mechanically, really someone who I liked coming into the league. As I said, for most of Nongshim, there's a reason I put them at number 8 in my power rankings when none of them played last year. But what Morgan does really well is know where he needs to be towards the back half of games, and he did that very well here, even on a champion that traditionally should fall off pretty hard, especially if he's down in gold. I do want to give a big shout out to the bottom 3 members of BRION as well here. Karis played really well, especially in game number 2 here on the Rise, was really taking over a lot of the map. Rise is an incredibly strong pick right now, and Karis, you know, one of those players that I think definitely needs to show a lot more before I feel super comfortable calling him like a decent starter in the LCK, but he had a pretty good series here. And then Henna and Effort, I mean, what happened here? I expected them to be one of the worst bot lanes in the league, but they were actually really solid in game number 2 here. They get the Lucian Nami 2 games in a row, of course matching with the Zeri Lulu. It's just what happens here in the LCK, and honestly, they look good. Henna looks really good on this Lucian. He's able to output a ridiculous amount of damage. Maybe Delight was the problem? Question mark. Obviously, Delight not having the best start to the year, and Henna looked really good in that game too. Even Effort, I thought, had some really good moments. This is somebody who was just so abysmally bad last year that pretty much anything that you're going to be getting out of him this year is going to be an improvement, so long as he's not completely just running it down like he did for Nongshim last year. It was good to see him at least remotely close to what he was in 2020 and 2021. And so, and then really the only player I didn't talk about on BRION was Umpty. He was fine in the jungle position, obviously. I wasn't exactly sure if it was going to be him or Raptor playing. Raptor is sick. I don't know if that influenced it, but it looks like Umpty's going to be the starter here, especially if this team continues to win. He was fine. He got really, really strong picks here. He got the Maokai in game 1, which is obviously broken. Got the Sedge in game number 2, which is fine. It does pair up really well with that Lucian Nami. It sets up Lucian really, really well towards the second half of that mid game. And honestly, I just thought Bro played okay. While they weren't perfect this series, they played a lot of the team fights exactly as they needed, especially in game number 2, and they were pretty happy to walk out of the series with the win. As for Nongshim, some positive things to show. I think the solo lane duo was actually really good here. I think Dingdin and Fiesta were both really, really solid players in this series. Top lane was consistently winning. Fiesta was doing a lot of damage on that Akali in game number 1. He really was the best player in the series. And then in game number 2, I actually felt really bad for this bot lane because while Henna and Effort were getting ahead, especially towards the mid game, it really felt like it was because of other parts of the map and not necessarily because of this bot lane. Peter especially, I thought, played game number 2 really interestingly. He played Lulu as this big roam champion, which you're really not going to see super often. Eventually got to the point where Lucian was just blowing him up, and so wasn't really all that effective towards the second half of that mid game, but I thought a lot of the macro plays that Peter was making were really solid. I've always been high on Peter's macro game. I think he's a lot better as an engager player, but I still think he plays the Lulu relatively well. He's just going to play it kind of in an interesting style. Unfortunately, I do have to give someone my dud of the series here for Nongshim, and it's going to go to Sylvie. He was really the only player that I felt relatively underwhelmed by. He just didn't really do all that much in this series. The Vi in game 1 just got outscaled by the Maokai. I hate Vi into Maokai. I think that is a very bad matchup for the Vi. Don't really think that there's a lot you can do. You can try to ult the Azir, you can try to ult the Lucian, but there's so much peel on the side of BRION that most of the time you're just going to go in, get immediately peeled off, and then die. That's kind of the Vi experience, especially into a comp like this. You're really not setting the Akali up for anything great. And then in game number 2 on the Viego, it's just too aggressive. I really think you needed something a little bit more passive here. You've got the Gragas, you've got the Victor, you've got the Zeri, you've got a lot of opportunities to win these fights. Viego is something that I think really, you just want to play at a very fast level, and especially this team comp, it's very aggressive, and I don't think that was necessarily going to play to their strengths. They ended up winning the early game and just getting outscaled. Well, I should say top lane won early, and then everybody else kind of just got outscaled. And that's just kind of how the series went. I don't think it's the worst series in the world for a young team like Nongshim. They certainly didn't get run over, and you could really argue they were the better team in game number 1. But it's certainly not something that makes me think like, oh, maybe this team is like sneakily going to try and force their way into top 6. I think they had that potential for me, but this series didn't exactly make me believe that in full. They didn't perform like that at this level against a team that, quite frankly, they could be able to beat. I'm not going to say they should be able to beat, but it wouldn't be shocking if Nongshim was able to win this series on paper. And so for them to just kind of, slowly die in this series, even if Fiesta was playing really well, or pretty well, I should say, definitely not the most comforting thing, I would say, overall for Nongshim. But for BRION, you gotta love how they start their season. It's not perfect. Game number 1 was certainly not perfect, but they were able to rebound. They were able to get things together. The bot lane looks okay. Karis looks like he can play. And Morgan definitely is a fun player. There's really no other way to put it. There's a reason that he is a Twitch chat icon, Lord Morgan. I saw somebody in a Reddit thread say that Morgan is the Morbius of the LCK. I think that's a fantastic comparison. He played really, really fun in the series. Backdoor in game number 1. Really good team fighting in game number 2. He's going to get the player of the series. I don't know if BRION's going to be like a really, really great team. This seemed like a team that struggled a bit to win the game, but eventually just kind of lucked their way into it. If they can do that a lot more, maybe they can force their way into playoffs, kind of like they did in spring of last year, but I would be a little bit hesitant on saying that they are a top 6 team after just seeing them perform here. Moving on to day number 3 action here in week number 1, and we had a historic rivalry kickoff day number 3. The Telecom Wars are alive and well as we had T1 taking on KT Rolster. And T1 is able to pick up the series win. It is a 2-1, the first 2-1 in the LCK. All 4 series in the first 2 days were 2-0s. Certainly something to keep in mind, but this is our first 2-1. T1 is able to pick it up after a game 1 loss. A nice comeback from them. None of the games were really all that close. There was certainly a team that was supposed to win all 3 of them, and all 3 of them ended up going that way. So let's go ahead and talk about it, starting with game number 1. Game number 1 was KT's win, and honestly, they played really well. Big credit to Aiming in this game number 1. He gets his Zeri, and honestly, he played really well on Zeri towards the back half of last year. It's interesting to see them go back to it. Clearly, they wanted to go to it and not the Lucian because they ban out the Lucian instead of the Zeri, and it's certainly been an interesting call, I would say, overall for most teams. Lucian Nami, generally speaking, I would say is just better right now. I think Zeri Lulu is strong. You can flex the Zeri Yuumi as well if you wanted to go something like that. But Zeri in general, I don't think is on the same power level, but Aiming clearly prefers that Zeri. We'll talk about that a bit later as we go further in the series, but clearly preferred that. He played really, really well on game number 1, was able to win the game for his team. Lehens did a really good job of being able to support him on that Lulu. And in game number 1, it looks like I was entirely wrong about Aiming. People were really mad in the comments of my power rankings video about how I put Aiming so low and that KT, I'm underrating them again. There is never a team that I get more comments about than KT Rolster on my videos. Clearly, they are the most popular Western team. I know that's not true, but it definitely is the case with hardcore fans that find hour-long podcast versions of these power ranking videos. KT is definitely the team a lot of people root for. And Aiming and Lehens looked to prove me wrong at the beginning of the series, but as we go throughout the series, we start to get a bigger picture of, I think, what I was talking about when I got a little bit concerned about this bot lane. Game number 2 happens, and Guma and KIA are really just able to run them over. They go back to the Sivir Yuumi, but this time KT goes to the Lucian Nami, and it just doesn't look nearly as good. This is a very bad game for the bot lane, a very good game for T1's bot lane. Guma looks fantastic on the Sivir. He's playing really aggressive. He feels like he has the confidence to move forward. A very passive comp again, a very similar comp, I would say, overall for T1, but a bit of a difference in the fact that you have Orianna in the mid lane instead of the Galio. Not as much immediate pressure, but a lot of team fight pressure, a lot more team fight pressure in my opinion, when you do these front-to-back 5v5s to give Gumayusi the chance to just win the game. It didn't really matter because the Sivir was pretty out of control by the mid game, and man, did the Cassante also get ahead on the top side. Big credit to Zeus. He played that Cassante like it was the most broken champion in the game, which it might be. It genuinely might be, but big credit to T1's bot lane. And then in game number 3, it was the exact same thing. Guma and KIA looked absolutely unstoppable in this one, and Faker looked unkillable on the Casa win. Very, very intriguing that they banned out the Lissandra and the LeBlanc of all things before the Kassadin. Don't really understand that on the side of KT Rolster. I think Kassadin is just better LeBlanc right now. I think Kassadin wins you the game in situations that LeBlanc basically has negative relevance in, but whatever, you want to give Faker the arguably the strongest mid laner in the game right now, and Kassadin, go ahead. Guma and KIA again play fantastic. KIA is going to get my player of the series here. He just completely outplayed both Aiming and Lehens in the second half of this series. His Yuumi was obviously good in game number 2, but it's really about this Ashe in game number 3 where he's just completely taking over. Not only is he doing a ridiculous amount of damage, he's completely stopping Lehens from playing the game on this River Heimerdinger, which we will get to in a bit, but he completely punishes Aiming for every mispositioning mistake that he has, and we'll get to that. He has a lot of them, because that's always been Aiming's big problem. And so, for KIA, really, really like how he's playing right now. Player of the series, he's looking like the best support in the world. He looked fantastic in the first series of the year. He looks fantastic in the second series of the year. He just continues to dominate. Faker looks fantastic in this series as well. Again, the Kassadin looks great, but even playing the more supportive mid laners in the first couple of games, obviously that's the style they wanted to go to a little bit more last year, where we saw Faker on a lot of these more shove and roam oriented mid laners. Things like the Talia definitely come to mind, but going to the Galio, going to the Orianna, it's certainly not something this T1 team is unfamiliar with, and it's certainly not something Faker is unfamiliar with. And when he does need to carry like he did in game number 3, he can absolutely do that as well. Guma played great on the Sivir, and he played really well on the Varus. I would argue that was his best game. And then Zeus on the Cassante. I mean, Cassante is just so broken. If you give him to a player like Zeus, it's just going to look like the most unplayable against champion in the entire universe, and that's kind of what happened in game number 2. Owner made some mistakes, was a little bit too over-aggressive in some of the Vi games, but for the most part, I thought T1 looked pretty cohesive and like a pretty good unit. For KT Rolster, like I said, they were really bouncing off of Aiming and Lehens in this series. That's clearly the lane that they wanted to invest a ton into in game number 1. It absolutely works out. They get the Zeri Lulu and they absolutely dominate. Aiming looks great on the Zeri. He's doing a boatload of damage because he has protection from the Jax, from the Syndra, from the Lulu. He's got a lot of ways to be able to get into these fights and do a lot of damage, and he's really just able to take over the game, end it in about 25 minutes. Game number 2, not so much. I thought Aiming played this game horrendously. You can talk about some mispositioning mistakes, it's fine. But Lucian Nami into Sivir Yuumi has to take advantage of some of the mid-game power spikes that Lucian gets. He just wasn't able to do that. It felt like he was just constantly out of position, and this really, I'll bring this up for Aiming now because I think game 2 was his worst game. We'll talk about game 3 because I think it's Lehens' fault in game number 3, but in game number 2, it really highlighted why I have Aiming lower than some of the other AD carries in the LCK, and it's because He's just so inconsistent. He's such a feast or famine player at the AD carry position. When he has great games, he can just straight up win you the game. He can 1v9, win your team the game. He can push you to playoffs, etc., etc. We kind of saw that in summer of last year where he had his best split of all time. He had those games, a lot of them in a row, where he was just one of the most dominant AD carries. He was carrying his team, but we've seen aiming for so many years as a pro, both in the LCK and in the LPL, and really what aiming has shown as a pro is that for as many of those fantastic carry-oriented games he has, he also just has the same amount of games where he's running it down, where he's actively losing his team fights, and that's kind of what happened here. He had a bad mid game on this Lucian where he really needed to step up and then made such a horrendous decision to step up and try and kill Guma towards the back half, got completely blown up and just immediately lost KT Rolster the game. And that's kind of the aiming that we have known throughout a lot of the years. He's a very talented player and someone who I do consider to be one of the few AD carries in the world that can actually just 1v9, like win you the game. I don't want to take away from how good I think aiming is. It's just the consistency of what aiming offers that makes me worry about whether or not seeing him as the main carry on a team like KT Rolster is, you know, something that is going to lead you to being top 4 and like a potential Worlds team. I'm definitely going to need to see some more consistency out of him. He wasn't really able to do it last year. It'll be interesting to see if they can pick it up this year. Game number 2, not a great indicator of that. And then game number 3, you pick the Zeri Heimerdinger. Don't like this lane at all. They have two completely opposite ideas of what they want to do in the game. And then Lehens just leaves. Like, what is going on? River Heimerdinger, I don't understand this. Lehens is going to get my dud of the series. He played bad in game number 2 on the Nami, was really not able to protect aiming at all in any of these mid-game team fights. And then game number 3, I mean, he just was nowhere. He had zero impact on the game. He was always in the wrong spot. This is what I was worried about with Lehens. I think he really benefited last year from having the most stable AD carry in the entire world playing with him in Ruler. I think going to a team that doesn't have nearly the same kind of clear direction that KT has this year, I think it's a little bit worrying. I don't think him and Aiming have very complementary play styles, and we kind of saw that. Aiming's not the player that's just going to play safe in lane. He's going to try to push these advantages. He's going to try to win his team the game. Lehens is somebody who wants to leave. He wants to be everywhere on the map. So you pick this Zeri Heimerdinger, first of all, a lane that I don't think has synergy on its own at the pro level. And then Lehens is leaving. He's not playing to the strength of the Zeri Heimerdinger lane, which is going to be this early push. And then he was wondering why Aiming is getting caught all the time. And then he's getting caught all the time. And it's just, it feels completely disjointed. I'm very worried about this KT Rolster bot lane. And if you'll notice, I haven't really talked about anybody else on the team because really this entire series for KT Rolster was about Aiming and Lehens, both for good in game number 1 and for bad in games 2 and 3. And so you really just need to get that consistency out of this bot lane before I feel comfortable calling this team anything higher than like top 6. Just because I really do feel like there are some things that this team needs to work out, and more specifically things that they need to prove before I really feel like they're going to be a team that competes for top 4 and for Worlds. But this top side of the map was fine. Keen got outplayed by Zeus, but that's okay. Cuz got outplayed by Owner, but that's okay. BDD got outplayed by Faker, but that's okay. Again, KT's really relying on Aiming to be able to win you games. Keen and BDD are both coming off of pretty poor years, and Cuz has certainly not been a superstar over the past few years. This is really Aiming's team to carry, and he's going to have to play consistent in order for them to get to where they want to be. But for T1, fantastic series. Really what you wanted to see. This bot lane continues to look like they're in Worlds form. Faker is playing even better than he did last year. He's playing like one of the best mids in the entire world right now, both on supportive mids and on carry mids. If he keeps that up, this T1 team is an easy lock for number 1 in the LCK power rankings, but Zeus looks great, especially when he gets those broken champions. Owner, maybe not on the same page as everybody, wants to play this more aggressive style. I think they're going to get on the same page they definitely were over the back half of last year. I think it's just going to take some time to get maybe Owner reeled back in just a tad bit, especially if Faker's going to take on this more dominant role of carrying. I think his voice is going to be a little bit louder in a lot of these fights. But overall, a really good series for T1. Not a bad series for KT, just some question marks that they need answering. And it's almost comical how predictable the telecom war is every single time they happen. KT winning game 1. T1 winning games 2 and 3. It feels like the same script every single split. Jumping into our second series here of day number 3, we had a series, a stomp, if you will. I don't want to preface it too much, I just kind of want to talk about it because there's not going to be a lot of analysis that I have to do on this one. We had Liiv SANDBOX taking on Damwon or Dplus KIA in their first series of the year. Golly, man, this is just one of the most demoralizing series I've watched in a very long time. It is rare to see this level of dominance in 2 games in a row from a team in the LCK, like against a team in the LCK. You usually don't see teams in the LCK play this badly in a series. I mean, what is going on? Dplus obviously wins this series 2-0. This is demoralizing. I mean, this is one of the biggest stomps I have watched in a very long time. This series was not remotely close at any point, and I'll just get into it. There's really not a lot of analysis I can give you. This might be a little bit of a shorter segment because it literally is just every player on Dplus being so much better than everyone else they are playing against that it never even mattered. Like, it never mattered for a split second. Game number 1 was an absolute stomp. You could give a lot of credit to a lot of different people. Canyon jungled circles around Willer. We'll talk about that in a bit. He gets Maokai 2 games in a row. First of all, let's talk about Dplus getting Maokai Lucian Nami in both games. What is happening? Am I losing my brain? Why are we prioritizing picking Zeri Lulu over getting Maokai Lucian Nami? Like, I just... like, I'm frustrated. I'm frustrated. It's such a dumb decision, but Canyon jungle circles around Willer. Deft and Kellen just look so ridiculous to play against. Like, it is almost unfair how good Deft and Kellen are playing right now, and the same is the case for game number 2, where Canyon again jungles complete circles around Willer, and Deft and Kellen just abuse Envy in the bottom lane. Deft is going to be my player of the series again here. This dude's on MVP pace after week number 1. An unbelievable week. He gets 2 games of Lucian Nami here, gets to play it in the first series as well, and it just looks unstoppable. Clearly, this is the bot lane that these two have practiced, and Deft playing strong side, honestly, it looks really, really good. This is not the same Deft that we had on DRX last year, where most of the time he was playing really, really well on weak side, was not given a ton of attention because they wanted to play around Zeka and around that jungle position so much on DRX. It's the opposite here. Showmaker, Kana, they are taking a little bit of a back seat, and Deft and Kellen are certainly taking priority early on, and it is absolutely working out for Dplus KIA right now. Deft looks completely unstoppable in a lot of these fights. The damage output that he's been able to do is ridiculous. They're destroying the 2v2 in lanes. It's not fair. Kellen looks like one of the best supports in the entire world through the first week of the season. That Nami looks impressive. Honestly, Kellen's always been more of an engaged player, so to see him pick up the enchanters and play really well, kind of like he did last year, is incredibly impressive. One of the most versatile supports in the entire world. He's going to quickly climb everybody's best support in the world ranking. And it's good to know that I was there a little bit earlier than everybody else, and it feels good to see that that's kind of come through in the games so far. And then topside's great. I mean, Canyon looks unreal on this Maokai, jungling circles around Willer. I think Willer did like 800 damage in game number 2. I mean, just something ludicrous. Canyon completely shut him out of the entire game. It's just not fair. Showmaker and Kana, while they didn't have like this huge impact on the game, they didn't have to. I mean, bot lane and jungle won so hard that they could take that secondary backseat, which is crazy to say for Showmaker, one of the best mids of all time, and Kana is somebody who had a really good opening series and somebody we know can really win. And so for Dplus, it's just such a dominant win, such an unbelievably dominant win, that it's really hard to say anything other than, like, they're just way too talented. They're so much more talented than their opponent. For SANDBOX, yikes, not how you want to kick off your season here. Willer, Envy, not good. I can only give dud of the series to one of them. It's gonna go to Envy because he played negative bad. Like, he played, I don't really know how to say it. Like, he was so far below what is needed to be an LCK competent bot laner that it's almost impressive that he got a job again. He was really bad in spring last year for the SANDBOX team. Ends up getting replaced by Prince, who finishes second in MVP voting. He comes back to try and take the job, and he is immediately destroyed by Deft. This is not a good look. SANDBOX is calling up everyone they know to see if anyone can play bot lane after this, because this was just abysmal. I love Kale as a player in the bot lane, but man, this was also not good from him. Just not a good performance from the bot lane overall. I already said it. Willer did 800 damage, I think, in game 2. It was either game 1 or game 2. I would say the Vi game, but that was both of them. Again, I can't stress this enough. Do not pick Vi if you are the worst team. It will do nothing. It will do literally nothing. And that is proven over and over and over and over again by everybody who picks it. In the LPL, it's the case, and that's the region I think Vi has played the best. Certainly the case in the LCK. It was certainly the case in the LEC over the past, weekend, which we'll get to when we do the LEC recap. It's just everywhere in the world. If you're the worst team, don't pick Vi. It's not going to work. I think if you're looking for upside on the side of SANDBOX, it's Closer in the mid lane, who at least had some performances. Again, good game on Ahri in game number 1. It just didn't matter. They got run over. The Azir game was meh, but that's kind of Closer in a nutshell, right? Like, this is a player who is good at these hyper-mobile, almost assassin-oriented picks, and, the assassin-oriented picks in the mid lane. Things like the Ahri, things like the Sylas, things like the Akali. That's going to be Closer, but you put him on the Azir, and he's not going to be able to carry these games It's never really been the playstyle for Closer. It makes me worry if Closer is the only guy on this team that can win you games, because I do think he is relatively draft dependent, and hopefully he can break out of that. Hopefully he can get a lot better at these more, you know, front-to-back team fighty champions. He's just never really been good at those. That's never really been his style. He was the worst Victor in the world last year, in my opinion. His Azir has never really been all that great either, and so hopefully you can get a better version of him, because I do think that he is the single best player on this team, and I don't think it's all that close. I mean, Kayle is really good, really like him as a player, but he's not going to have any success if he plays with Envy this year, who just looks like the worst bot laner in the entire league. Bertle is absolutely nothing in the top lane, even on a champion broken like K'Sante. Willer got jungled circles around. I mean, the SANDBOX team, it is time to hit the panic button, and it's one series, because this was awful. I get it, it's against Dplus, but I haven't watched a series. I haven't watched a team play this bad across 2 games in quite a long time. This was a shellacking. And then for Dplus, I mean, great. Your Deft and Kellen look like the best bot lane in the world. Canyon is jungling circles around everybody he's playing against. Kana and Showmaker don't really have to do all that much, because the rest of the team is winning super hard. This is exactly how you want to kick off the season if you are Dplus KIA. It's a 4-0 in week number 1. What else could you ask for? This team is looking like one of the best in the entire world, and I think we're all thinking the same thing. I cannot wait for the inevitable T1 versus Dplus matchup when it comes in the regular season. Moving on to day 4 action of week 1 now. We kicked off day 4 with a really intriguing matchup. 2 Worlds teams from last year, obviously both of them looking quite different, as we had a series between Gen.G and DRX, both going into the series at 0-1, 0-2, both looking for a huge win, and unfortunately for DRX, Gen.G is definitely going to be the one walking out of the series feeling a lot better, as they are able to take both Game 1 and Game 2, and both in relatively clean fashion. Gen.G was clearly the better team in this series by a considerable margin, and a lot of that has to do with the 2 carry roles. These are the 2 players that I think really need to step up for Gen.G to really be taken seriously as a contender over the course of the year, and they absolutely did in this series. Chovy and Pez both played very, very well, and both had pretty solid bounce backs from the first series of the year that they had, of course, against T1. Chovy in particular, I actually want to talk about first, because he's no longer on the Taliyah and the Ahri. He's on the Sylas, he's on the Akali. Things that he can actively completely take over the game with, things that can damage other players, like actively a lot, not just a little bit. You know, Taliyah can hurt, obviously Ahri can hurt too, but nothing compared to what Akali is going to be able to do, and man did Chovy look good on this Akali. I think he was doing 1k damage per minute on this Akali, something absolutely ludicrous. A really good series from him. And the Sylas game in game number 1 was also incredibly oppressive to play into. We'll talk about Fate in a minute, but Fate really had no shot of being able to play into Chovy in this series. It was a complete lopsided mid lane matchup. And then we get to talk about the bot lane. This is obviously the biggest area of worry for Gen.G fans across the globe, because you're looking at Pez, you're looking at Delight, you're looking at a rookie that, while I do love him, and I do think he was really good in Challengers, is joining a team that has World Championship aspirations and really needs to perform without ever having played a game at a top level. And then Delight, a player who has played at the top level, but for a bad team, let's say it, a lower tier organization, and has never really been the focal point of that team in the first place. And so a lot to prove from them, and they looked great in this series. Pez is actually going to get my player of the series for Gen.G. The Jhin game in game number 1 was pretty good. Didn't really have to do a whole lot. I do like the Jhin pick overall. I think it's almost underrated as an AD carry right now. There is a lot that Jhin can do that a lot of other AD carries can't, especially into something like Varus, where you can really control the tempo and the pacing of the game overall. And then Delight on this Karma looked great in game number 1, but really where they shined, or shone, or whatever you want me to say, was game number 2 here on the Zeri Yuumi. Obviously, this bot lane, incredibly dangerous to play into, but I would say, for the most part, is kind of weak to the Lucian Nami. It's not a trade that I would often want to make if I was a bot lane. I would prefer Lucian Nami for the most part. Pez like go for the Zeri Yuumi, and Pez completely pops off. He gets a ton of protection on the side of the K'Sante Wukong, a ton of peel, and then Chovy just doing 1k damage per minute on an Akali. I mean, that's obviously going to help, but Pez really destroying that backline on the Zeri. I think you could give player of the series to either of them. For me, I'm going to give it to Pez, but Chovy absolutely deserves it as well. Delight also played fantastic in this series. If those 3 can continue to keep up the pace that they are on, obviously this team is going to be very, very solid. There's a reason I had them as number 3 in my power rankings, and I'm not really too shaken up by the fact that they lost to T1 early on. On the side of DRX, another really bad series. Like, there's really nothing else to say. They get destroyed by Dplus. They get destroyed by Gen.G. Obviously, these are two very good teams, two of the top 3 teams in the region, in my opinion. But it is worth noting that they were not competent and not close in any of these games. They were 0-4 by a large margin. My dud of the series could go to a lot of people on the side of DRX, but for me in this one, it is going to go to Fate in the mid lane. I know you're going to look at the scores and you're going to say Krako should get it, or Beryl should get it, or hell, even Dectum should get it, which I'll talk about that in a bit. None of them played well, but for me, Fate was the standout bad player for this DRX team. He continues to look completely lost. He was somebody who just has never really been that guy that has impressed me in the LCK. He's obviously been a consistently good mid laner for quite a while, but I'm very worried about whether or not he is going to be able to hold up against some of the best mid laners in the region, especially with how this season has started. His Victor looked completely irrelevant. I mean, I hate this build on Victor in general, this more passive, like, Zhonya's, Seraph's, like, idea. I don't think you're really going to be doing all that much. Victor needs to do damage, especially in this comp with Varus, where Varus can't hurt, but you've got a Soraka, you've got a Vi, hell, you've even got a Fiora. You need someone that's going to be able to deal consistent teamfight damage, and that really has to be Victor in this case, and that just was not what Fate wanted to do, I guess. And then Sylas going into Akali in game number 2, he just got completely run over. He was so outclassed by Chovy. It was actually ridiculous. So Fate is going to get my dud of the series. He was bad in Series 1. He's bad again here in Series 2. We got to talk about the rest of the team, though. Krako was awful again. I'm really starting to get concerned. Krako is obviously a player I really like, and I really liked going into the year, but you put a jungler who has kind of been up and down and really has had some pretty decent teammates over the course of the beginning of his career on a team that is a complete disaster. Like, this could be a Nongshim scenario from last year and a Dread scenario from Krako, where he's a pretty decent jungler, but someone who just can't get anything done, looks like absolute garbage on a team that has no pushing lanes, has no pressure at all, and he's still trying to make plays. Again, don't pick Vi into Maokai. Stop doing it. You picked the Sejuani in game number 2. I like that a lot more. Giving Lucian Peel, trying to make sure Dectum can at least try to win the game, and hopefully you can have Rascal win on the top side and transition that into something. But Krako just looked lost the entire series, completely out-jungled by Peanut. And then Dectum and Beryl continue to look like a negative bot lane for this team. Dectum looks lost early on in the season. Obviously, I like Dectum, and he's been really consistent over the past 2 years, whether it was on Nongshim or whether it was on Damwon last year. I think he looked consistent as a player. He's someone who's always going to be better towards the back half of the games. I don't think this meta suits him particularly well. I think you want to get him on things like the Aphelios and ideally something like the Zeri, where he can just kind of play super safe in the early game. I don't think that's what you can do right now. You have to play through bot lane. It's really the strongest lane in the meta by a large margin, and I think Dectum is definitely going to struggle in that. You have Beryl pulling out the Soraka in game number 1. It certainly did not work. He got blown up a ton, and then the Lucian Nami lane just looked awful from both sides in game number 2 from DRX. It's really the only player on DRX that looked at all competent through the first week of the season for me is Rascal up on that top side, who is a decent player, but there's only so much you can do, even on the Camille. So for DRX in general, bad start to the year. I mean, 0-4 is about as bad as it gets, and they looked incompetent. Yes, it's against 2 of the better teams in the league. I'm going to hold out from hitting the full panic button and saying no chance they make playoffs just yet, or saying that they are the Nongshim of 2023 just yet, but definitely not the way you wanted to start the year. Even if they were going to go 0-4, you wanted to see them be at least competent in some of these games, which they just weren't. Hopefully, once the schedule gets a little bit easier, they can get some momentum and some confidence under their belt, but for now, it just looks bad. As for Gen.G, this is what you wanted to see, is a nice bounce back here. Chovy and Pez look great. Delight looks a lot better if that bot lane can continue to grow. Hopefully, Pez can turn into an upper half AD carry in the league. This team is going to be able to compete with some of the better teams in the league. Doran and Peanut didn't have to be the carries in this game. That is a good sign. Peanut has always been better as that secondary carry, as that more passive player on his team. He was that last year for Gen.G. He was like that for Nongshim a couple of years ago. Even for LGD back in 2020, there have always been moments where Peanut has looked fantastic, and a lot of that has been when he can take some of the onus off of his shoulders. If Gen.G can kind of play through this mid, play through this bot lane, they are going to be one of the more interesting and better teams in the league, even if they're not able to directly compete with teams like T1 and Damwon right now. Moving on to our second series here of day number 4, we have 2 teams here that are really looking to try and find their footing towards the bottom of my power rankings, but potentially moving up, as we had a matchup here between the Kwangdong Freecs and BRION, and BRION picks up another win here, a 2-1 series win this time, instead of a 2-0, but that's a 2-0 start for BRION, and that is a very good look. Yes, it's against, the 2 rookie teams to start off the year, and it's not like they were the most dominant series of all time, which we will get to, but it is really, really solid to see BRION sitting at 2-0 to start the year. So what ended up happening in this series? Well, game number 1 was a really strong bro win. This was just a bro win from start to finish. Karis looked phenomenal here on the Syndra. He was really able to take over a lot of the game. And again, I'm actually going to talk about this first. We're seeing LCK teams do something very strange in draft, in my opinion, which is prioritize Zeri over Lucian Nami, which I just don't get. I don't get it at all, if I'm being entirely honest with you. I think at this point we have proven that Lucian Nami is better. It wins about 75% of the time against Zeri and anybody, whether that's Lulu, whether that's Yuumi, it doesn't really matter. It wins about 75% of the time, and so you're looking at a matchup that is pretty favored Lucian Nami. Not only is it favored, but I would argue that Lucian Nami is just stronger generally, even if you wanted to go in a direction that wasn't Zeri. And so you're looking at 2 drafts in a row from KDF on blue side, which is Zeri first pick, allowing Maokai Nami on red side, which is just so bad. Like, there's really no other way for me to put it. I get that they won game 2, but that shouldn't give you an indicator that this draft strategy is smart. And honestly, we're seeing a lot of LCK teams do it, and I don't understand it. It just seems so weird to me to allow both Maokai, Lucian, and Nami on red side. Like, I just don't get it. Obviously, Bro switches things up. Goes for the Lilia in game 3, which obviously plays to their strengths just a tad bit more. We'll talk about in a bit, but these drafts are so weird. Karis looks great in game 1, though, on the Syndra. Obviously, a very strong mid laner in the meta right now. I think there are a lot of mid laners that are pretty strong. Probably the most versatile role right now in terms of what you can pick is mid lane. Karis looks good on the Syndra. Game number 2, though, is KDF's, and a lot of that is off the back of their young mid laner in Bulldog. Again, I got a lot of comments in my preseason power rankings video that I was underrating Bulldog. Hopefully you guys are right. I would really love to be wrong about some of these young players, right? I'd love for a player like Bulldog to surprise me and be one of the best LCK mids. He looked really, really good here in game 2 on the Victor. Able to control the pacing of the game, was up in lane by quite a bit, was given a lot of resources, and was actively able to win his team the game. Now, obviously, Taiyun played really, really well here, and Dudu looked really good in that game 2 on the Cassante as well. But Bulldog was definitely the main proponent and the main carry threat, which is why I find it so infuriating to me that you put him on the Karma in game number 3. Why are you putting the player that just carried your game number 2 on Karma in game number 3? You're putting so much pressure on this young AD carry in Taiyun, who's playing with the support in Moham that he did not play with last year or in the first series of the year, which I should note, June is out, Moham is in the series. I don't know if that's permanent or if they're just trying to find out which support, you know, kind of works better for this team, but Moham was in the series, and Taiyun's given a ton of pressure again to play Zeri here in game number 3. Bro is finally on blue side. You know what they pick? First pick? Nami, because they realize that Lucian Nami is stronger than Zeri and whatever, and so they end up picking the Nami. They put Taiyun on the Zeri, and it doesn't work out for KDF. Bro is able to snowball the game out of control. Picks this Lilia, which really is able to completely take over. He's able to carry the game on it. He's actually going to get my player of the series for this Lilia game, and I don't want to take away his impact on the Maokai either. I know a lot of people are really bored of this Maokai, and they don't think it's very fun to watch, and I agree with you, but played it well, even if it isn't exactly this team's style. I think on a more carry-oriented jungler is certainly something that they're going to like a bit more. You have Morgan on an aggressive top, Karis on something that scales into the late game, and then Henna and Effort on Lucian Nami because clearly no one else wants to pick it against them. I think that's kind of the style that Bro has shown that they want to play, and looked really good. I think you could give player of the series here to Karis in the mid lane. That Syndra game in game 1 was really solid, and he did a lot of damage on his ear in game number 3. I just was a little bit concerned with how he played in game number 2, kind of getting outplayed by Bulldog. So for me, player of the series is going to go to who controlled the series pretty much from moment 1, while game 2 certainly wasn't perfect on the Maokai. Game 1 was really solid on that Maokai, and game 3, he did a ridiculous amount on that Lilia, really controlling the entire tempo. So that jungle mid duo looking pretty solid for Bro. Morgan continues to just kind of be what he is in the top lane. He gets some Gnar, he gets some Renekton. Those are really the 2 picks that you look at for Morgan. And then Henna and Effort, if they're going to keep getting Lucian Nami, they're going to continue to look good. Hopefully, you know, some teams wake up and realize, oh, maybe we shouldn't just give Lucian Nami over on red side every game, just for my sanity's sake. But if Henna and Effort continue to get it, they're going to look solid. It's the same thing that, in my opinion, right now is happening with Dplus. Just obviously, they're a much better team with much better players. But, you know, if you continue to get Lucian Nami, you're probably going to continue to look good. As for KDF, you know, draft aside, continue to hate their drafts aside, you're putting a lot of pressure on these young players. Now, Bulldog is the one that I would encourage you to put that pressure on. He looked really good in this game 2 on the Victor. He did look good in Series 1. He's clearly this team's best young player. You're going to want to play through him. He is going to be the one that should be getting a lot of these resources. Him and Gen.G clearly have a pretty decent chemistry together. Dudu certainly had some good games this series. He was really good in their first series, but the game 3 on the Gnar really wasn't all that great. Got outplayed by Morgan and, et cetera, et cetera. I think that top side, though, at least has something to build off of. This bot lane is really concerning in a bot lane-centric meta. It looks like Taiyun is just not the kind of player that you want to hang your hat on as the guy that should carry you in a lot of these games. Moham came in and tried to play support. Didn't really feel all that different from when June came in and played support. 2 games of Yuumi and 1 game of Lulu was hard to tell if you're playing really well. It's not really a big skill expression bot lane here. Lucian Nami is really going to control the tempo, and unless they mess up, you really don't have a lot of pressure. And so Taiyun's going to get my dud of the series here, just because he was given a lot of responsibility. He was given this first pick Zeri pretty much every single game and just wasn't really able to do anything on it. You pick that Karma in game 3, you pick the Gnar in the top lane, the Lulu. That game 3 draft is entirely on you as the AD carry, and he did not play well at all. That bot lane really is going to need to step up if KDF wants to be anything more than one of the worst teams in the league, but there is promise on this team, which I think is good to see. If you can get some of that jungle mid duo to translate around the map, I think KDF is going to be much more competent at playing some of these teams. It's just not a great look to be completely outplayed in the bot lane by Henna and Effort. But on Bro's side, this is kind of what you wanted to see. It's another pretty solid victory, not something that I'm over the moon about. A lot of people are going to look at the 2-0 win, or 2-0 start for Bro, and be like, okay, well, maybe they're a playoff team. I'm not going to jump the gun. They beat Nongshim and KDF, 2 rookie teams that are going to need some time to get acclimated, and even in those series, it's not like they looked like they were leaps and bounds, like country miles ahead of their opponents. This series was certainly better. Umti and Karis, I thought, played really well. Henna and Effort are continuing to grow as a duo, and then Morgan is Morgan in the top lane. This series was certainly more cohesive than their first series of the year, but it's not something that I'm completely convinced is going to translate against some of the better teams in the league. I think once their schedule gets harder, it's going to be really interesting to see how this Bro team adapts. But for now, starting off the year 2-0 is just about as good as you could ask for a team like BRION. Jumping into the final day of LCK, week 1 action here with day number 5. And it was kicked off with a really interesting series. Really our first major upset of the week, I would say, as we saw Liiv SANDBOX take down Hanwha Life Esports. A pretty big upset. Hanwha really not clicking in the way that everybody wants them to start the year. I did predict that just a tad bit, so interesting to see them, kind of struggle to get things together, but really good for Liiv SANDBOX to be able to pick up this series win. They absolutely needed it after getting shellapped in their first series of the year, but it certainly wasn't the cleanest. I'm going to come out and say this right now. This series was more about one team or both teams trying to lose than both teams trying to win. It's just one team tried to lose a little bit harder than the other one. So we'll go ahead and get to that. Game number 1 was a Liiv SANDBOX win. Closer looks really good on this Akali. He generally looks good in their wins here. We will get to that in a bit. Envy also with a really nice bounce back. Gets to play as Ezreal here in game number 1. Always been his best champion if you go back to his time in Challengers. And also in spring of last year, he always preferred the Ezreal quite a bit. You complement that with a bit of damage on the Wukong side. Even the Karma's going to be able to offer at least a little bit, so that quote-unquote lower damage Ezreal compared to like a Zeri just isn't going to be nearly as much of a problem. And then you've got the Cassante for Peel in the top half. It's a pretty decent draft, and then game number 1, I would say draft on Hanwha Live's side is pretty good as well, but it is very scaling-oriented. Jax, Azir, Zeri, a lot of scaling going on in game number 1. So Liiv SANDBOX is able to jump out to a pretty early lead here with Closer playing well in the early portions. Gotta point out in game number 1, Kud plays awful on the Sejuani. That's going to continue as the series goes on. He played awful in the first series of the year, played awful in the second series of the year, and then Viper with a really weird play towards the back half of the game. This game was actually really close for a while, and instead of trying a front-to-back team fight with Zeri and Azir, Viper jumps into Baron Pit and just dies on the Zeri, and that is very, very strange. Don't really know what happened there, but that's part 1 of the every game is kind of just decided by which team wanted to lose more, and in this game it was definitely Hanwha with Klid and Viper kind of running it. Game number 2, that was definitely Liiv SANDBOX who wanted to lose more. Hanwha played okay. Zeka gets another game here on his Sylas. He's obviously going to be really, really good at that. Viper and Life have a pretty decent bounce back game here on the Zeri Lulu, but this game for me is about Closer just completely running it down on Akali. He had a very good game 1 on Akali, a very bad game number 2 on Akali, and this is kind of what Closer is, right? Very good on these assassin champions. He does get his signature pick here in Akali, what I would argue is his best champion, maybe outside of LeBlanc, but LeBlanc not particularly meta right now. I know teams are still picking her, but Akali's just better, right? So for Closer to get her in game 2 and just be awful, like completely outplayed by Zeka. It's not a great look, I would say, overall for Liiv SANDBOX, and this is another game where I would just say that SANDBOX wanted to lose it more than Hanwha wanted to lose it, so SANDBOX loses. Zeka looks good, nobody else on the team really looks good. Another very similar case to what they had in their first series of the year. And then game number 3, again, going back to it, Closer gets on the Sylas, this time taking it away from Zeka. He puts him back on the Azir, a champion that he is good at, but not great at. And we get another instance of Klid just running it on this Sejuani. A completely terrible game from him. And so overall, good win for SANDBOX. Closer looks really good in games 1 and 3 and really, really awful in game 2. He's still going to get my player of the series because at the end of the day, he still was the reason SANDBOX won this series, but it's not really improving my thought of Closer all that much. He looks really good on the champions he's supposed to look really good on. And then when he gets outplayed, he loses harder than almost anybody in the league. That's kind of always been what Closer does. You see a lot of threads right now about how Closer is elo stuck on this SANDBOX team. I think he is about where this SANDBOX team is. He's certainly the best player and the one that they should be trying to win through, but when he loses, man, it is not graceful by any means, and so he can actively lose your team games, but at least he has the talent to win your team some games, which the SANDBOX team needs desperately. But really the big standout, the big surprise, I would say, in this series is Envy. A good bounce back. He's playing against Viper, who I thought was going to be the best AD carry in the league. He, in my opinion, was the best AD carry in the LPL last year. Certainly did not have a great series, Viper didn't. Some good moments, especially in lane, but Viper really didn't seem like the kind of player to play super passive like he did in this series. I did not expect for him to come into the series against maybe the worst AD carry and just get out pressured early, but that's kind of what happened. Really good Ezreal game from Envy in game 1, and he played the Varus well in game 3 as well. Great bounce back. Him and Kale hopefully can continue to build some synergy and be a lot closer to what this SANDBOX team had, obviously, in summer of last year with Prince. Obviously, you're not expecting Envy to be Prince, but you're hoping that it's at least closer to that than it is to what Envy offered in spring of last year. And then Willer and Bertle were there. Not really huge standouts. On the side of Hanwha Life, interesting series. Not particularly great, and definitely not great that you lose this, but there are some positives. Zeka continues to look really solid on this team. It reminds me a lot of 2021 Hanwha Life, obviously, with Chovy in there. Zeka continues to be the one that pushes forward, even on champions that I would consider not his wheelhouse. He struggled on Azir for a majority of last year. Yes, I do think he played the champion really well at Worlds, but he was a Sylas, Akali, etc. kind of player, a melee player, and Azir was kind of his big ranged pick. I think putting him back on it here was definitely a good choice by SANDBOX to get Closer into a matchup that he felt a lot more comfortable with, and he clearly took advantage of that, but Zeka still looked really good, still the best player on this team by a large margin. Viper, without making some of the major mistakes, still looked okay, but everybody else was kind of tragic. Life offered absolutely nothing on this team. I hate the Ezreal Heimerdinger lane. Really don't know what that's for. You're going to be poking out Varus Karma? Okay, sure. Go ahead and try. And then Kingen and Klid on the top side just did not play well. Kingen was a complete non-factor. The Renekton in game number 3 was completely and utterly useless. Don't really understand that pick at all. And then Klid continues to be awful. He's going to get my dud of the series here for Hanwha Life. That's his second of the week, even though this team goes 1-1. He looks like he's going to be holding this team back a lot, and that is not a good look. Obviously, Klid is a player that has succeeded in the past on very good teams, but he very much does not look like he has any synergy with any of these players. He hasn't looked good on engagers. He hasn't looked good on tanks. He hasn't looked good on carry threats. I'm concerned. Klid might be a player that we see get a mid-year replacement, because right now for Hanwha, this is a team that probably wants to try and contend for top 3, top 4, even top 2 in the league. They are nowhere close to that if Klid is going to be playing like this. So really, no matter how good Zeka is, this team is always going to be at least a little held back by that jungle position. And top lane's not been great. Some mistakes made in the bot lane. Hanwha's got a lot to figure out. There are certainly some question marks for this team. Luckily for them, they do have a pretty good baseline with Zeka in the mid lane. At the very least, it feels like he is going to be able to perform this year at a really high level. If you can just get some of the other pieces to become a little bit more consistent, perhaps Viper and Life can get on the same page, as we go throughout the season a tad bit more. King can perhaps get back to that weak side King that he was for a lot of last year, and maybe you can get literally anything out of Klid, or even just replace him at this point, honestly. Whatever you get out of him is completely house money, and so if you can just get the 4 other members of the team to be, solid, I think Hanwha can get back to that spot, but it is going to take some improvement. This team definitely feels very disjointed right now. As for SANDBOX, it's a good win. Not exactly the most clean wins in the world for this SANDBOX team. I don't exactly love how this team looked in week 1. Yes, they got steamrolled and then they won, but I still think that there was a lot to improve on this team. This top side continues to be meh. Like, Bertle and Willard just don't inspire a ton of confidence in me. Envy and Kale had a really good series. That's really the big plus, I would say, overall for SANDBOX here, is if you can get them to be average at their positions, that's probably going to be positive. And then Closer had some good games, some bad games. That's kind of what you expect out of him in the mid lane. Overall, looking at the outlooks of these teams, SANDBOX is probably a team that, you know, is just on the outside of the playoff berth. I'm really not super sold on them after this series, especially after what we saw out of them at the beginning of the year. But if they can continue to put together big wins against good teams like this, that's going to be a good thing for Hanwha. I have no idea. This team just needs to get back on track, and until then, we just really need to see how the other teams around them are going to perform before I kind of decide on whether or not to move them in or out of the top 4. That's going to bring us to our final series here of Week 1 LCK action, and it's a fun one between two teams that I actually think are really, really fun to watch this year. Of course, those being RedForce RedForce and KT Rolster. And KT is able to pick up the 2-1 series win. It was looking a little shaky after game number 1, but KT's able to hang in there, rebound in games 2 and 3, and pick up the series win that they absolutely needed to have to avoid a pretty disastrous start to the year. 0-2 is not really where you'd want to be, especially losing to Nongshim. And so, a big win for KT. Let's go ahead and talk about it game by game here. Game number 1 was won by Nongshim, and it was off the back of a pretty interesting draft. Wukong Yuumi. I mean, that's a really, really scary combo if things go right. And Sylvie actually played really, really great in game number 1. Want to give a big shout out to Sylvie. I had to give somebody dud of the series earlier in the week for Nongshim. Unfortunately, that did end up being Sylvie, but I think he's a really solid and talented player, and I think the Wukong game really proved that, where he was just outplaying Cuz like the whole time. It really wasn't all that close. He was able to get BDD to use his ult on the clone in a really integral fight, and Wukong with Yuumi on the back, he's going to go in, full engage, full knockup, permanent healing, he never dies. It is a really big problem, and so Nongshim with a really good game number 1 win, and from that point on in the series, it's looking like, oh, Nongshim's actually strong. Like, KT is really struggling. You know, you're up 1-0 here. Sylvie looks really good. Din looks good in the top lane. Vital and Peter are playing really well as a bot lane duo, but then you get to games 2 and 3, and BDD really kicks in. Game number 2, all BDD on this Yone, really able to take over the game in the mid part. I want to give a big shout out and some credit to Aiming and Lehens. They were much better in this series than they were in their first series of the year against T1. They looked a lot more consistent. They really weren't the big threats in this series, which is solid. I think that's a really good place for KT to settle in. I'll talk about that a bit more later, but I think they looked like they were on a better page together as opposed to two really individually talented players. But this is still BDD's game on the Yone, even if Aiming looks really good on the Zeri towards the back half. And then game number 3 was all BDD on this Ryze. Zac Ryze as a duo is actually really scary to deal with. Aiming does a really good job piloting this Ezreal to be able to outmaneuver a lot of the engage attempts that Nongshim has on the other side with the Jackson, with the Sejuani. They're really trying to target down that AD carry position. Aiming clearly knew that he had to play safe. I really like Ezreal Karma as a lane right now, especially into something like Heimerdinger, which I think you can really punish early, and so I do really like this Ezreal Karma idea. BDD playing the Ryze to be able to scale. BDD's Ryze has always been exceptional. That's one of the champions that I think we all know him most well on, and he definitely proved that in game number 3. BDD is going to get my player of the series here for KT Rolster, and I think it's a pretty easy shout to say that. This is really what you wanted to see out of KT if you were a KT fan. Yes, Aiming has the potential to win a lot of these games 1v9, but he's not going to be the most consistent player in the entire world, especially when you put one of the most aggressive and coin flippy supports in the world with him in Lehens. I think you really wanted to see somebody else on this team be able to step up and carry a series. And if BDD can do that, as opposed to what he was in 2022 for this Nongshim team, that is going to be absolutely huge for KT's outlook as a whole. He looked fantastic in this series, not only on really aggressive picks like the Yone, but on something a little bit more standard like the Ryze, something that's going to be, you know, pretty okay in lane, is going to be able to split push a bit, going to be able to team fight a bit, going to have some macro sense. That's what you want to see out of BDD. You want to see him be able to be that secondary carry that can kind of shift into a primary carry role at times for KT Rolster. When Aiming's having good games, let him cook. BDD can be that secondary carry. He can push forward. Him and Cuz can play really well as that secondary duo kind of roaming around the map. But when Aiming and Lehens really aren't having one of those games where they're absolutely dominating in the bot lane, you need somebody else who's going to be able to step up and win you games, and it's really good to see that BDD might be that for KT over the course of this year. It's something they didn't really have for most of last year out of that mid lane spot. Vikla coming in helped it a lot, but I still wouldn't have considered Vikla this super takeover player like we know BDD can be. And so to see him play really well here is a really big weight off the shoulders. Aiming and Lehens were a lot better. Already talked about that. The one negative I want to point out at least a little bit is going to be Cuz in the jungle. definitely got outplayed in game number 1. There's really no other way to put it. Sylvie completely controlled the map, and he was a little bit up and down throughout the rest of the 2 games. Now, I've always been a little bit lower on Cuz than the consensus. I wasn't super high on him last year. That certainly did not carry over into this year. I wasn't super high on him going into this year, and so I don't know. Hopefully he can improve. He definitely looks like the weak link of this KT Rolster team right now, and, you know, Keen in the top lane's fine. There's really not a lot to talk about. That's why I'm not bringing him up. But Cuz was fine. He was okay. Want to see a little bit more consistency out of him, especially on these more passive picks, like the Sejuani, like the Zac, that I think are going to be a lot better for KT overall, putting the onus on players like Aiming and BDD to be able to carry the game. I think Cuz just needs to get a little bit better at playing his role there. He's always been better, in my opinion, at carry-oriented junglers, and so it'll be interesting to see if he adapts to that. But overall, I still think KT looked pretty solid. As for Nongshim, this is a young team that definitely showed a lot of flash here. This series was close at points. Game 1 was obviously in their favor, and Game 2 was close. I think really when things started to go down is when they, KT that is, realized that they needed to just kind of slow the tempo down, play with a little bit more macro, play with a little bit more tempo, and play less just trying to skill check a lot of these really talented young players. I think that's when things started to fall apart. Sylvie is an incredibly mechanically talented player, but he's still a young jungler, and he's going to be able to fall apart in the back half of the game. That is what happened. Similar things happened to Fiesta, who is going to get my dud of the series on the side of Nongshim. I like Fiesta a lot as a player. I think he's really, really solid as a prospect in the mid lane position. Him and Sylvie together, I think, form one of the more interesting jungle mid duos in the entire league in terms of upside, but he just got outplayed in this series. He just got outplayed by BDD. Not a problem. It happens. BDD is a good mid laner, but you really need to see Fiesta become a little bit more consistent if Nongshim wants to compete for one of those top 6 spots. It doesn't feel like they're going to be able to do that a ton this year, but it is worth noting. There is some positives. I think Sylvie played really well in game 1, like I said. Peter and Vital were actually really consistent over the course of the series. They weren't really pressuring a lot. I think they played pretty passive, and they weren't necessarily contributing to, like, winning League of Legends, but they weren't losing the game, which is a positive, and Dundun in the top lane was fine. 2 games of Cassante, a game of Jax. It's really hard to point out top lane as a big weakness. I really do think if the jungle mid was a little bit more consistent over the back half of games 2 and 3, Nongshim was probably looking at a series win here. But unfortunately, Fiesta not able to get it done. Sylvie a little bit inconsistent after that really good game 1. So what does this mean overall for the outlooks of these 2 teams? Well, I think for KT Rolster, it's really, really important that you picked up a win here. This kind of solidifies the early part of the season for you. You're sitting at 3-3 now, which I think is a lot more manageable than potentially a 2-4. You certainly didn't want to be sitting there. And so for KT, you got to feel good with this series win. BDD, like I said, looks a lot better. So you have that secondary carry on your roster. If you can figure out some of the minutia details, like Cuz potentially just not performing up to expectations, then I do think this team is going to be able to compete for that top 6, top 4 spot. It's just a little bit hard to, kind of project where they are right now. It's still very early in the season. And then for Nongshim, the young players are showing definitely it's a little bit of promise, but there is a long way to go. This is clearly a team that is coming straight up from Challenger. I think a good win in game number 1, some contesting in game number 2. There is good on this team. They just have to refine it just a tad bit at the top level, but I think you're looking at both of these teams as relative positive takeaways from this series. Nongshim doesn't really need to win this year in order for them to be successful. KT kind of does, but they were able to pick up a win here, and they were able to do it off the back of a player that wasn't named Aiming. So I think both teams are going to be coming out of this series with pretty positive perceptions. All right, that is going to do it for my LCK Week 1 overview and analysis. Up on the screen, you are going to see the updated LCK standings after Week 1. In the first column, you're going to see, obviously, the teams. In the power rankings column, you're going to see my personal power rankings. In that second column that says change, you're going to see how those have changed from my preseason or last week's power rankings to this week. So let's go over the biggest risers and the biggest fallers. One thing a lot of people are going to notice is that there really aren't a lot of changes. It's week 1. It is very difficult to get a good grasp on how a lot of these teams are going to project over the course of the year after just week 1. It is a lot can change. A lot can be adjusted there. I don't want to make too many crazy changes. I don't want to overreact to just 2 series, so I'm going to be a little bit hesitant to make some major changes, but there are some, most notably Bro jumping up to number 7 from number 9. They are the number 1 team sitting right on the outside of playoffs for me. I think if things continue to go the way they are for DRX, which we'll get to in a second, they could continue to rise. The other riser this week is KT Rolster jumping from 6 to 5. They just jump over DRX, who falls from 5 to 6, and then with Bro jumping up to 7, some other teams have to drop down. That's Liiv SANDBOX dropping to 8. That's Nongshim dropping to 9. I think this is about where a lot of these teams are in the power rankings, but We've also got my player of the week and my dud of the week here in week 1 in the LCK. Both were pretty easy selections this week, in my opinion. Player of the week, no surprise, is going to go to Dplus KIA's Deft in the bottom lane here. Really, really fantastic week for Deft. He was given a lot of resources, and he paid it off. It'll be interesting to see if the Lucian Nami continues to come through in the draft for other teams against them, because man, dude, does Deft look good on that Lucian, but for now, I mean, week 1 was about as perfect as it could go for this DK team and for Deft in general coming off of a world championship. And then dud of the week, also really, really easy to pick for me in general. It was going to be Klid, the jungler for Hanwha Life. Hanwha Life is a good team. They even won a series this week, but man, Klid was just a little bit of an elo merchant this week. If he can get a little bit more consistent, a little bit better, that team is going to skyrocket to the top of these standings. But for now, he is going to be a huge hindrance to this team. And it's very, very concerning to see a team that really wants to go to Worlds have a player like Klid playing the way that he is right now. Obviously, he can improve. We know he's a good player in the past, but it just doesn't look great at the moment. So Deft is going to be my player of the week. Klid is going to be my dud of the week, but that's going to do it. If you guys did enjoy the video, let me know down in the comment section below. And of course, leave a like. It really does mean a lot for the channel. Do you agree with my player of the week and my dud of the week? Do you disagree? Who's too high? Who's too low in my power rankings? You know to leave all of that down in the comment section below. But with all that being said, I hope you all are having a great day. I hope you continue to have a great day. And I will see you all later.